The reception was held in the same venue, a beautiful garden space that had been transformed into something magical. The transformation was largely thanks to my mother's weeks of preparation. The hand-sewn table runners, the carefully arranged centerpieces, the thoughtfully placed lighting that created the perfect ambiance. As guests moved from the ceremony to the cocktail hour before dinner, the space revealed itself in all its glory. The late afternoon sun filtered through the string lights my mother had hung, creating a warm, golden glow that made everyone look beautiful. The tables were arranged with mathematical precision, each centerpiece positioned at exactly the right height to encourage conversation, while allowing clear sightlines across the room. Every detail bore my mother's fingerprints. The custom napkin ring she had crafted from wood and ribbon, the place cards written in her careful calligraphy, the small potted herbs that served as both decoration and take-home gifts, each one grown in her own garden and transplanted into terracotta pots she had painted by hand. But as guests moved from cocktail hour to dinner, my mother once again became invisible. She wasn't seated at the head table with the wedding party. She wasn't given a special corsage to distinguish her as the mother of the bride. She wasn't introduced during the reception or given a moment to speak. The seating arrangement had been a source of stress for weeks. Gabriel's family had made it clear that they expected his parents to be prominently featured, seated at the head table, or at least at a table very close to the action. When I had suggested that my mother should be similarly honored, Gabriel's mother had said, "Oh, of course, we'll make sure she has a nice table." But a nice table turned out to be table 12, near the back of the reception area, far from the head table where Gabriel and I sat with our wedding party. Instead, she found herself at a table with distant relatives who barely acknowledged her presence. While other parents of the bride and groom were being toasted and celebrated, my mother sat quietly, occasionally getting up to discreetly handle small issues: a spilled drink, a fallen napkin, a guest who needed directions to the restroom. Her tablemates included my great-aunt Ruth, who was nearly deaf and communicated mostly through confused smiles, and my second cousin Mark, who spent the entire dinner talking loudly about his new business venture, while his wife scrolled through her phone. The other seats were filled with family friends I hadn't seen in years, people who had been invited out of obligation rather than genuine connection. During dinner, I watched from the head table as my mother noticed that one of the elderly guests was struggling to cut her meat with arthritic hands. Without hesitation, my mother quietly got up, walked over, and offered to help. She spent several minutes gently cutting the woman's food into manageable pieces, then returned to her seat without fanfare. The elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, was one of Gabriel's great aunts. She had been struggling with her dinner, too proud to ask for help but clearly frustrated with her limitations. My mother had been watching, had noticed the woman's difficulty, and had responded with the same instinctive kindness she showed everyone. After my mother helped her, Mrs. Patterson looked around confused, trying to figure out who this helpful woman was. She asked the person next to her, "Who was that lovely lady who helped me?" "I think she works here," came the reply. Later, when the band took a break and some guests seemed restless, my mother disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a playlist on her phone, connecting it to the venue's sound system to keep the atmosphere lively. She had anticipated this possibility and had prepared a carefully curated selection of songs that would appeal to all age groups. The playlist was another example of her thoughtful preparation. She had spent hours selecting songs that would bridge the gap between generations, choosing music that would appeal to my teenage cousins and Gabriel's elderly grandparents alike. She had even researched which songs were popular at weddings, which ones would encourage dancing, and which ones would provide good background music for conversation. When the band members returned from their break, they were surprised to find music still. They all ignored her at my wedding, until the photographer asked, "Are you the owner of this place?" Narrated by the daughter. From the moment I said yes to Gabriel, my entire world revolved around one singular focus: creating the wedding of my dreams. Every detail had to be absolutely perfect. The dress, the venue, the decorations, the catering, the flowers, the music. I spent countless hours scrolling through Pinterest boards, consulting with vendors, and meticulously planning every aspect of what I believed would be the most important day of my life. But there was one thing I failed to plan for. One detail that never crossed my mind in all those months of preparation: how people would treat my mother on that day. My mother had always been the invisible force behind every milestone in my life, though I was too young and self-absorbed to truly understand the magnitude of her sacrifices until much later. When I think back to my childhood, I can now see her fingerprints on every happy memory, every achievement, every moment of security I took for granted. When I graduated high school, she was the one who stayed up all night pressing my cap and gown, making sure every wrinkle was gone. But what I didn't know then was that she had also secretly contacted my guidance counselor to ensure I would be recognized for perfect attendance, something I had never even thought to care about. She had been tracking my attendance all 4 years, calling the school whenever I was sick to make sure it was properly recorded, because she knew that scholarship committees looked at those details. When I got into college, she worked double shifts at the local diner to help pay for my textbooks. But the full story was even more heartbreaking. She had taken on a second job cleaning offices at night, working from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. after her regular 8-hour shift at the diner. For 2 years, she survived on 3 hours of sleep per night, fueled by coffee and determination. She developed chronic back pain from the cleaning work, but never complained. Never told me about the nights she came home and soaked in a hot bath with Epsom salts, tears streaming down her face from exhaustion and physical pain. When I landed my first job, she was the one who drove me to buy my first professional outfit, even though it meant she'd have to skip lunch for the rest of the week. But again, there was so much more to the story. She had researched interview techniques online at the public library, printed out articles about workplace etiquette, and even practiced mock interviews with me. She had called her own sister, who worked in corporate America, to get advice on appropriate attire and office culture. She wanted me to have every advantage, every piece of knowledge that might help me succeed. She never asked for recognition. She never demanded the spotlight. She never even hinted at the sacrifices she was making. She simply existed in the background of my life, making sure everything ran smoothly, that I had everything I needed, that I never felt alone or unsupported. She was like a guardian angel, invisible but omnipresent, orchestrating my success from the shadows. The wedding planning was no different, except now her invisible labor was magnified by the scale and importance of the event. While I was busy being the bride, stressed about flower arrangements and seating charts, caught up in the excitement and pressure of planning what I believed would be the most important day of my life, my mother was quietly handling all the logistics that I was too overwhelmed to notice. She coordinated with vendors when I was at work, speaking to florists and caterers with a level of detail and attention that impressed even these professionals. She picked up decorations when I was too tired, making multiple trips in her old car to transport items that wouldn't fit in a single load. She handled the endless phone calls about dietary restrictions and last-minute changes, keeping a notebook filled with detailed notes about each guest's needs and preferences. But her involvement went far beyond basic coordination. She had researched each vendor extensively, reading reviews, comparing prices, negotiating better deals to stay within our budget. When the original cake decorator canceled 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother spent 3 days calling every bakery in a 50-mile radius until she found someone who could recreate the design I had chosen. More than that, she had spent the past 3 months hand-sewing table runners, creating centerpieces in her small apartment, and personally crafting dozens of small details that would make the venue feel warm and personalized. Her fingers were permanently stained from working with flowers, and she'd often fall asleep at her sewing machine, surrounded by fabric and thread. Her apartment had been transformed into a wedding workshop. Every surface was covered with supplies, ribbons, beads, artificial flowers, fabric samples, color swatches. She had converted her dining room table into a crafting station, where she spent hours each evening after work creating magic with her hands. Her living room had become a storage area for completed projects, carefully organized in labeled boxes containing everything from hand-painted place cards to custom napkin rings. She had taught herself new techniques through YouTube videos, practicing intricate beadwork and embroidery until her arthritic fingers ached. She had visited every craft store in town, hunting for the perfect materials, often driving to multiple locations to find exactly the right shade of ribbon or the precise style of button she needed for a particular project. The centerpieces alone represented weeks of work. She had designed them herself, sketching different arrangements until she found the perfect balance of elegance and warmth. Each centerpiece contained fresh flowers that she arranged the morning of the wedding, but also incorporated handmade elements, small glass votives that she had decorated with delicate lace, wooden accents that she had sanded and painted by hand, and tiny fabric flowers that she had sewn individually. She had even learned calligraphy to address the invitations, spending hours practicing until her handwriting was perfect. When I had casually mentioned that I wished we could afford professional calligraphy, she had quietly enrolled in a class at the community center, practicing every night until she could create beautiful, elegant lettering that rivaled any professional service. The morning of my wedding, my mother arrived at the venue 2 hours before anyone else. I can still picture her stepping out of her old sedan, wearing a navy blue dress that she had sewn herself, elegant in its simplicity, but clearly not from any expensive boutique. Her graying hair was pulled back into a neat bun, secured with bobby pins she'd had for years. She carried a small purse and wore the same modest heels she'd worn to church every Sunday for the past decade. She had that tired smile she'd worn for years, the smile of someone who had spent her entire adult life putting others first, who had sacrificed her own comfort and desires to ensure that those she loved could have theirs. What I didn't know then was that she had been awake since 4 a.m., putting the finishing touches on the wedding favors she had handmade for each guest. Small sachets of lavender from her own garden, each one tied with a ribbon, and a handwritten note thanking people for being part of our special day. She had spent the previous evening ironing every table runner twice, ensuring not a single wrinkle would mar the reception tables. The night before, she had also quietly resolved a crisis that I never knew about. The florist had delivered the wrong color roses for the centerpieces, and instead of waking me with the problem, my mother had driven to 3 different flower shops at dawn, using her own savings to purchase the correct flowers. She spent 2 hours in the venue's storage room, carefully rearranging every centerpiece to match my vision perfectly. Her hands bore the evidence of her labor: small cuts from rose thorns, fingertips stained purple from handling ribbon, a bandage on her thumb from where she had pricked herself while sewing until midnight, but she had covered these marks with makeup, not wanting anything to distract from the perfection of the day. While I was getting ready with my bridesmaids in the bridal suite, sipping champagne and taking selfies, my mother was already at work. She moved through the venue like a ghost, quietly adjusting flower arrangements that had shifted during transport, polishing water glasses that had water spots, straightening chairs that weren't perfectly aligned. She didn't complain. She didn't draw attention to herself. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it, the same way she had approached every challenge in her life. As guests began to arrive, I watched from the bridal suite window as my mother continued her quiet work. She helped elderly guests find their seats. She guided lost cousins to the right section. She discreetly cleaned up when someone spilled wine on the white tablecloth. But here's what broke my heart. No one saw her as my mother. In her simple dress and practical shoes, moving efficiently through the venue, many guests assumed she was part of the catering staff. The first incident happened within minutes of guests arriving. My college roommate, Jennifer, who had flown in from California for the wedding, approached my mother with barely a glance. "Excuse me," Jennifer said, not even making eye contact. "Where can I put my gift? And is there somewhere I can touch up my makeup?" My mother patiently directed her to the gift table in the powder room, her voice warm and helpful despite the dismissive tone she had received. Jennifer walked away without a thank you, already pulling out her phone to take selfies. But the interactions only got worse. I watched in horror as Gabriel's aunt, a woman dripping in designer jewelry and carrying a purse that cost more than my mother's monthly rent, snapped her fingers at my mother. "Excuse me," she said in that entitled tone that wealthy people use when they think they're talking to the help. "Could you bring me another glass of champagne? And make sure it's properly chilled this time." My mother paused, and for a moment, I thought she might correct the woman, might explain who she was. Instead, she simply nodded politely and said, "Of course, I'll see what I can do." She didn't bring the champagne. She quietly moved away, her dignity intact but her shoulders slightly more hunched than before. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the pre-ceremony cocktail hour, I watched as various guests treated my mother like she was invisible, or worse, like she was there to serve them. Gabriel's college friends joked loudly about the cute little lady who's been so helpful. One of my own relatives asked her to dispose of their empty plate, assuming she was clearing tables. But the worst moment came when Gabriel's grandmother, a woman who had insisted on being driven to the venue in a hired car, actually grabbed my mother's arm and said, "Girl, where is the bathroom? And while you're at it, this music is too loud. Tell someone to turn it down." The word girl hit me like a slap. Here was this elderly woman, probably only 10 years older than my mother, addressing her like a servant, grabbing her arm without permission, making demands without any courtesy. My mother gently freed her arm, and with infinite patience, directed the elderly woman to the restroom. She then spent 10 minutes speaking quietly with the band leader, asking them to lower the volume slightly. She did this not because she had to, but because she wanted every guest to be comfortable, even those who had dismissed her so callously. I also witnessed something that still makes my chest tighten with shame. My maid of honor, Sarah, spilled red wine on her dress during the cocktail hour. She was in a panic, worried about the photos, when my mother appeared quietly beside her with a small stain removal kit she had brought just in case. For 15 minutes, my mother worked meticulously to remove the stain, her expertise evident in every careful dab and rinse. When the stain was gone, Sarah looked at my mother with surprise and said, "Oh my God, you're amazing." "What do I owe you?" My mother smiled sadly and replied, "Nothing at all. I just wanted to help." Sarah pressed a $20 bill into my mother's hand and walked away without another word, never realizing she had just tipped the mother of the bride. But there were even more incidents that I learned about later. Gabriel's business partner had asked my mother to validate his parking ticket, assuming she worked for the venue. One of my cousins had handed her a dirty napkin and pointed toward a trash can. An elderly gentleman had actually patted my mother on the head and called her a good girl when she helped him find his reading glasses. Each interaction was a small humiliation, a tiny cut to her dignity, but my mother handled each one with grace, never correcting the mistake, never revealing her true relationship to the bride, never allowing anyone else's ignorance to affect her own behavior. The pattern continued throughout the cocktail hour. Guests would approach her with requests, demands, or dismissive comments, and she would respond with kindness and helpfulness. She became everyone's go-to person for problems, questions, and assistance, but never as the honored mother of the bride, always as the helpful lady, or that woman who's been so nice. I watched one particularly painful exchange where Gabriel's coworker asked my mother to take a photo of him and his wife. She obliged graciously, taking several shots to make sure they got the perfect picture. When she handed the phone back, the man said, "Thanks, sweetheart. You're really good at this. Do you do photography as a side business?" My mother just smiled and said, "I'm just happy to help." What made these interactions even more heartbreaking was seeing my mother's face after each one. She would maintain her pleasant expression during the encounter, but afterward, when she thought no one was looking, I could see the small flicker of hurt in her eyes, the way her smile would fade just slightly, the small sigh she would let out before composing herself for the next interaction. She was being treated as invisible by people who should have been honoring her, dismissed by people who owed their enjoyment of the evening to her hard work, reduced to a service provider by people who should have been celebrating her as the mother of the bride. Each interaction was like a small knife to my heart, but I was caught up in the whirlwind of being the bride, in the receiving line of congratulations and photos, in the orchestrated chaos of the wedding day timeline. I told myself that I would fix it later, that I would make sure she was properly recognized during the reception, that there would be time to honor her once the ceremony was over. But even as I made these mental promises, I could see that the damage was being done. My mother was being systematically erased from her own daughter's wedding, reduced to a helpful stranger, overlooked and undervalued by people who should have been acknowledging her central role in making the entire celebration possible. During the ceremony itself, my mother sat in the front row, as is traditional for the mother of the bride, but even then, she seemed to fade into the background, while Gabriel's mother, dressed in an expensive cream-colored suit and professionally done hair and makeup, commanded attention and posed for photos with various guests. My mother sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, watching her daughter get married with tears of joy in her eyes. What I didn't realize at the time was the significance of where she was sitting and how she had ended up there. The traditional front row seating should have been a place of honor, but even that had become a source of quiet humiliation. When the guests were being seated, the ushers, young men from Gabriel's fraternity who had volunteered for the job, had no idea who my mother was. When she approached the front of the ceremony space, one of them had stopped her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the front rows are reserved for immediate family," he had said, gesturing toward the back of the seating area. My mother had quietly explained that she was the mother of the bride, and the young man's face had flushed with embarrassment. But the damage was done. Other guests had witnessed the exchange, had seen her questioned and redirected like someone trying to sneak into premium seating. Even worse, when she did take her seat in the front row, she found herself isolated. Gabriel's family filled the opposite side of the aisle. His parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, all dressed in coordinated colors, all clearly belonging to a cohesive family unit. They chatted among themselves, posed for photos, and commanded the attention of arriving guests. On my mother's side, the seating was sparse and disconnected. My father had passed away when I was 12, so there was no one to sit beside her as an equal. My handful of relatives were scattered throughout the seating area, and none of them seemed to recognize that they should be sitting with her, supporting her, acknowledging her central role in the day. The photographer, a professional I'd hired after months of research and a significant portion of our budget, took hundreds of photos during the ceremony. He captured every moment, every angle, every emotion. But somehow my mother remained largely absent from these images. Not because she wasn't there, but because she wasn't demanding attention, wasn't positioned prominently, wasn't adorned in the kind of outfit that draws the camera's eye. When I look at the ceremony photos now, I can see her in the background of some shots, always blurred, always peripheral, always secondary to more prominent figures. In the photos where she is visible, she looks small and alone, dwarfed by the grandeur of the event happening around her. The ceremony itself was beautiful, everything I had dreamed of. Gabriel and I exchanged vows that we had written ourselves, promising to love and support each other through all of life's challenges. The officiant spoke about the joining of two families, the creation of new bonds, the celebration of love. But as I stood at the altar, holding Gabriel's hands and speaking my vows, I caught a glimpse of my mother in the front row. She was crying, tears of joy, I knew, but she was crying alone. No one was holding her hand. No one was sharing the moment with her. No one was acknowledging that this was her moment too. Gabriel's mother, by contrast, was surrounded by family members who kept leaning over to whisper comments about the ceremony, who squeezed her hand during emotional moments, who included her in their shared experience of the wedding. She was clearly the center of her family's attention, the honored mother whose son was getting married. My mother was simply a witness, isolated in her front row seat, experiencing one of the most important moments of her life in solitude. During the ceremony, there was a moment when the officiant asked the families to stand and offer their blessing to the union. Gabriel's family rose as one, a unified show of support and celebration. On my side, my mother stood alone, her single voice lost among the chorus of approval from Gabriel's relatives. Later, during the ring exchange, I made eye contact with my mother and saw such love and pride in her eyes that it nearly broke my concentration. She mouthed, "I love you," and smiled through her tears. But no one else was looking at her. No one else was capturing that moment. No one else was witnessing the pure joy and love radiating from the woman who had made this entire day possible. The Unity Candle ceremony was particularly poignant. Gabriel and I each took a candle that had been lit by our mothers, symbolizing the bringing together of our two families. When my mother lit my candle, her hands shook slightly with emotion. She had practiced this moment, had thought about its significance, had looked forward to this symbolic participation in the ceremony. But when the photographer captured the moment, he focused on Gabriel and me, not on the mothers who were providing the flames. My mother's contribution to this symbolic act was rendered invisible, just like everything else she had done for the wedding. After the ceremony, during the receiving line, guests congratulated Gabriel and me, shook hands with Gabriel's parents, and then walked right past my mother. Most didn't realize she was anyone significant. Some offered polite smiles, assuming she was a family friend or distant relative. Very few stopped to congratulate her specifically as the mother of the bride. I watched this happening from my position in the receiving line, but I was trapped by the protocol and flow of the event. I couldn't break away to ensure my mother was being properly acknowledged. I couldn't stop the line to introduce her to each guest. I could only watch as she was once again overlooked and dismissed. The reception was held in the same venue, a beautiful garden space that had been transformed into something magical. The transformation was largely thanks to my mother's weeks of preparation. The hand-sewn table runners, the carefully arranged centerpieces, the thoughtfully placed lighting that created the perfect ambiance. As guests moved from the ceremony to the cocktail hour before dinner, the space revealed itself in all its glory. The late afternoon sun filtered through the string lights my mother had hung, creating a warm, golden glow that made everyone look beautiful. The tables were arranged with mathematical precision, each centerpiece positioned at exactly the right height to encourage conversation while allowing clear sightlines across the room. Every detail bore my mother's fingerprints. The custom napkin rings she had crafted from wood and ribbon, the place cards written in her careful calligraphy, the small potted herbs that served as both decoration and take-home gifts, each one grown in her own garden and transplanted into terracotta pots she had painted by hand. But as guests moved from cocktail hour to dinner, my mother once again became invisible. She wasn't seated at the head table with the wedding party. She wasn't given a special corsage to distinguish her as the mother of the bride. She wasn't introduced during the reception or given a moment to speak. The seating arrangement had been a source of stress for weeks. Gabriel's family had made it clear that they expected his parents to be prominently featured, seated at the head table, or at least at a table very close to the action. When I had suggested that my mother should be similarly honored, Gabriel's mother had said, "Oh, of course, we'll make sure she has a nice table." But a nice table turned out to be table 12, near the back of the reception area, far from the head table where Gabriel and I sat with our wedding party. Instead, she found herself at a table with distant relatives who barely acknowledged her presence. While other parents of the bride and groom were being toasted and celebrated, my mother sat quietly, occasionally getting up to discreetly handle small issues: a spilled drink, a fallen napkin, a guest who needed directions to the restroom. Her table mates included my great-aunt Ruth, who was nearly deaf and communicated mostly through confused smiles, and my second cousin Mark, who spent the entire dinner talking loudly about his new business venture, while his wife scrolled through her phone. The other seats were filled with family friends I hadn't seen in years, people who had been invited out of obligation rather than genuine connection. During dinner, I watched from the head table as my mother noticed that one of the elderly guests was struggling to cut her meat with arthritic hands. Without hesitation, my mother quietly got up, walked over, and offered to help. She spent several minutes gently cutting the woman's food into manageable pieces, then returned to her seat without fanfare. The elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson, was one of Gabriel's great-aunts. She had been struggling with her dinner, too proud to ask for help but clearly frustrated with her limitations. My mother had been watching, had noticed the woman's difficulty, and had responded with the same instinctive kindness she showed everyone. After my mother helped her, Mrs. Patterson looked around confused, trying to figure out who this helpful woman was. She asked the person next to her, "Who was that lovely lady who helped me?" "I think she works here," came the reply. Later, when the band took a break and some guests seemed restless, my mother disappeared for a few minutes and returned with a playlist on her phone, connecting it to the venue's sound system to keep the atmosphere lively. She had anticipated this possibility and had prepared a carefully curated selection of songs that would appeal to all age groups. The playlist was another example of her thoughtful preparation. She had spent hours selecting songs that would bridge the gap between generations, choosing music that would appeal to my teenage cousins and Gabriel's elderly grandparents alike. She had even researched which songs were popular at weddings, which ones would encourage dancing, and which ones would provide good background music for conversation. When the band members returned from their break, they were surprised to find music still playing and guests happily chatting and dancing. The lead singer approached my mother to thank her, but she had already melted back into the crowd, unwilling to take credit for solving a problem that wasn't technically hers to solve. The most heartbreaking moment came when my 4-year-old nephew began crying loudly during the dinner speeches. His parents, embarrassed, were trying to quiet him when my mother appeared with a small bag of coloring books and crayons she had brought specifically for the children. She sat with him for 20 minutes, helping him color and whispering gentle stories until he was calm and happy again. What made this moment particularly painful was watching the reaction of other guests. Several people commented on how professional the childcare was at the venue, how thoughtful it was of the wedding planners to provide entertainment for the children. My mother had become so invisible that even her kindness was attributed to someone else. But the absolute worst moment came during dinner. Gabriel's father stood to give a speech, thanking everyone who had made the wedding possible. He spoke eloquently about love, about family, about the joy of welcoming me into their family. He mentioned the venue coordinator, praising her attention to detail. He thanked the catering staff for the delicious meal. He acknowledged the florist for the beautiful arrangements. He thanked the band for providing wonderful music. He thanked his own wife for her impeccable taste in helping to plan the reception details, crediting her with choosing the perfect color scheme and decorative elements. He thanked the bridesmaids for their support, the groomsmen for their friendship, and even the photographer for capturing every precious moment. He thanked me for bringing such joy into their family, and spoke about how happy he was to gain a daughter. He talked about watching Gabriel and me grow as a couple, about the bright future that lay ahead of us, about the love that had brought us all together. But he never mentioned my mother, not once. Not a single word of acknowledgement for the woman who had created every beautiful detail he was praising, who had solved every problem behind the scenes, who had made the entire celebration possible through months of unpaid labor and sacrifice. I looked across the room and saw her sitting there, still smiling that tired smile, applauding politely as if she hadn't just been completely overlooked by the man whose son she had helped raise by extension, whose wedding she had made possible through her sacrifice and hard work. Even more painful was watching the other guests' reactions. Several people seemed to realize the omission, glancing uncomfortably toward my mother's table. But no one said anything. No one stood up to correct the oversight. No one demanded recognition for the woman who had made the entire celebration possible. My mother simply continued clapping, her face serene, as if being invisible was her natural state. She showed no sign of hurt or disappointment, no indication that she expected anything different. She had spent so many years being overlooked that this moment, painful as it was, seemed to be exactly what she had anticipated. Gabriel's father's speech was followed by applause, and then by the best man's toast, which was funny and heartfelt, but equally void of any acknowledgement of my mother's contributions. Then came the maid of honor's speech, which focused on our friendship and my happiness, but never mentioned the woman who had made it all possible. As the evening continued, my mother dealt with a series of small crises that threatened to disrupt the celebration. When the cake server went missing, she produced a backup from her emergency kit. When one of the string lights went out, she had replacement bulbs ready. When a guest complained that the bathroom was out of paper towels, my mother quietly went to her car and retrieved extra supplies she had brought just in case. Each time, she solved the problem quietly and efficiently, then faded back into the background. The guests whose problems she solved rarely bothered to thank her, and when they did, it was with the casual appreciation reserved for service staff, not the gratitude due to the mother of the bride. During the father-daughter dance, I had requested that the DJ play In My Daughter's Eyes by Martina McBride, but since my father had passed away, I had asked my mother to dance with me instead. It should have been a moment of recognition, a chance for everyone to see her as the parent who had raised me, who had earned the right to this honor. But even this moment was diminished by the circumstances. The DJ, not understanding the situation, announced it as a special dance for the bride and her friend. Several guests seemed confused by the choice, whispering among themselves about why I was dancing with that helpful lady instead of a male relative. My mother and I danced to the song, and I could feel her trying not to cry. This should have been her moment to shine, her chance to be recognized as the parent who had earned this dance through years of love and sacrifice. Instead, it became another moment where her relationship to me was questioned, diminished, or ignored. After the dance, instead of returning to the head table where she should have been seated as my honored parent, my mother went back to table 12, back to her seat among the distant relatives and forgotten friends, back to her role as an observer rather than a participant in her own daughter's wedding celebration. As the evening progressed, the reception moved into full swing. The band played, couples danced, and the celebration reached its peak. But by around 10 o'clock, as the party began to wind down and some guests started to leave, my mother had retreated to a quiet corner. She sat alone on a wooden bench at the edge of the garden, looking out at the party she had helped create. The string lights she had hung cast a warm glow over the scene, and the flowers she had arranged still looked perfect despite hours of celebration. From her vantage point, she could see everything, the guests laughing and dancing, the tables still decorated with her handmade centerpieces, the space transformed by her vision and labor into something magical. But she was watching it all from the outside, like a spectator at her own daughter's wedding, rather than a central participant in the celebration. Marcus, the photographer, was making his rounds, capturing the final moments of the evening. He was a thoughtful man in his 40s, someone who had shot hundreds of weddings and had developed an eye not just for beautiful shots, but for the human stories that unfold during these events. Marcus had been photographing weddings for over 15 years, and he prided himself on seeing beyond the obvious moments. While other photographers focused solely on the bride and groom, Marcus had learned to observe the entire ecosystem of a wedding, the family dynamics, the quiet moments of emotion, the people who made the celebration possible, but often went unnoticed. As he moved through the venue, his professional eye took in all the details, the way the lighting created the perfect ambiance, the thoughtful placement of decorations, the seamless flow of the space. These weren't accidental details. Someone had planned every element with incredible care and attention. He had been noticing throughout the evening that the level of thoughtfulness in this wedding was unusual. Everything was perfectly coordinated, but not in the way that spoke of expensive wedding planners or professional decorators. This was the work of someone who cared deeply about every detail, who had put their heart into creating something beautiful. He noticed how the table runners were perfectly aligned, how the centerpieces were arranged at just the right height to encourage conversation, how the lighting had been positioned to create intimacy without being too dark. This level of detail and care went beyond what most wedding planners provided. This was the work of someone who truly cared about creating something beautiful. Marcus had also been observing the woman on the bench throughout the evening. His photographer's eye had been drawn to her repeatedly, not because she was demanding attention, but because of the quiet way she moved through the celebration. He had watched her help guests, solve problems, and handle small crises with grace and efficiency. He had noticed her during the cocktail hour, quietly adjusting flower arrangements and polishing glasses. He had seen her during the ceremony, sitting alone in the front row while Gabriel's family filled their side with coordinated support. He had observed her during the reception, seated at a back table but constantly getting up to help others. What struck him most was the contrast between her obvious familiarity with every detail of the wedding and her treatment by the other guests. She moved through the space like someone who knew exactly where everything belonged, who had planned every element, who was responsible for the magic that everyone was enjoying. But the guests treated her like hired help, like someone who happened to be useful, but wasn't really part of the celebration. His photographer's instinct told him that whoever had designed this space had put their heart into every detail. And as he looked around the venue, his eyes kept coming back to the woman sitting alone on the bench. He had noticed her throughout the evening. She had been everywhere, quietly adjusting things, helping guests, ensuring everything ran smoothly, but she had done so without fanfare, without recognition, without seeming to expect any appreciation for her efforts. There was something about her that didn't fit the typical wedding dynamic. She clearly knew the venue intimately, understood every detail of the celebration, and moved with the confidence of someone who belonged. But she was being treated as an outsider, acknowledged only when people needed something from her. Marcus had seen many weddings where family dynamics were complex, where people were overlooked or marginalized, but he had never seen someone who was so clearly central to the celebration while being so systematically ignored by the participants. As he watched her sitting alone on the bench, surrounded by the beauty she had created, but excluded from the joy it was generating, Marcus felt compelled to understand her story. His journalistic instincts, honed by years of capturing human moments, told him that there was something important happening here that everyone else was missing. Marcus approached her slowly, his camera hanging around his neck, his expression curious and respectful. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but are you the owner of this place?" My mother looked up, surprised by the question. "Oh, no," she said with a soft laugh. "I don't own the venue. I don't mean the venue itself," Marcus clarified, gesturing around the garden. "I mean, all of this. The way everything is arranged, the attention to detail, the care that's gone into making this space feel so warm and welcoming. Someone created this atmosphere, and I've been watching you all evening. You seem to know exactly where everything belongs, exactly how everything should be." My mother's expression shifted from confusion to something softer, more vulnerable. I helped with some of the decorations," she said quietly. "Some of the decorations?" Marcus asked, his photographer's eye reading the story that others had missed. "Ma'am, I've shot over 300 weddings. I can tell when someone has put their heart into creating a space. This isn't just some decorations. This is love made visible." He gestured toward the centerpieces, each one a work of art that combined fresh flowers with handmade elements. "These arrangements, the way they're positioned, the way they complement the natural beauty of the garden. This is the work of someone who spent months planning every detail. Marcus pointed to the string lights overhead. The lighting design creates perfect ambiance for both dinner conversation and dancing. The height, the spacing, the way they're woven through the trees. This wasn't done by a venue coordinator. This was done by someone who cared about creating magic. He indicated the table settings, where every element worked together in perfect harmony. The way the napkins are folded, the positioning of the place cards, the integration of the potted herbs as both decoration and gifts. Every single detail has been thought through with incredible care. My mother's eyes began to fill with tears as Marcus continued to catalog the evidence of her love and labor that surrounded them. "And I've been watching you all evening," Marcus continued. "You move through this space like you created it, because you did. You know exactly where everything belongs because you put it there. You anticipate problems because you planned for them. You handle every crisis because you prepared for every possibility." He paused, studying her face. "But more than that, I've been watching how the guests treat you. And I've been watching how you respond to that treatment. You've been dismissed, overlooked, and taken for granted all evening, but you've handled it with a grace that tells me this isn't new for you." Marcus had seen enough family dynamics to recognize the patterns of invisible labor, the way some people gave everything while asking for nothing, the way love was often taken for granted by those who benefited from it most. I had been across the garden, saying goodbye to some departing guests, when I noticed the photographer talking to my mother. Something about the scene made me stop and pay attention. I could see my mother's face changing as they spoke, could see her sitting up straighter, could see a light in her eyes that had been absent for most of the evening. I moved closer, not wanting to interrupt, but needing to understand what was happening. "Every single detail here shows incredible thought and care," Marcus was saying. "The way the flowers are arranged to complement the natural landscape, the way the lighting creates intimacy, the way the table settings feel both elegant and welcoming. Someone spent months planning this, didn't they?" My mother nodded slowly. Yes. I wanted everything to be perfect for her, for my daughter." "Your daughter?" Marcus asked, and I could hear the realization dawning in his voice. "The bride," my mother said simply. "I'm Elena's mother." The photographer's expression immediately shifted to one of understanding, and then something that looked like amazement. "You're the mother of the bride? And you created all of this?" By this point, I was close enough to join the conversation, and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. Here was a stranger, a professional who had seen hundreds of weddings, recognizing what I had failed to see all evening, that my mother was the heart and soul of everything beautiful about this day. "Yes," I said, my voice catching as I approached them. "She is the owner of this place. She's the owner of everything that brought me to this moment. She's my mother." Marcus immediately raised his camera, but not in the aggressive way that wedding photographers sometimes do. His movements were respectful, almost reverent. "Would you mind if I took some photos? I feel like I've been missing the most important story of the evening." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus photographed my mother in the space she had created. He captured her touching the flowers she had arranged, her hands showing the small cuts and stains from weeks of preparation. He photographed her straightening a table runner one last time, her attention to detail evident in every gesture. But most importantly, he photographed us together, mother and daughter, surrounded by the beauty that she had created for me. As the camera clicked, I found myself really looking at my mother for the first time that day. I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the satisfaction. I saw the way she had sacrificed her own comfort to ensure my happiness. I saw the love that had been poured into every detail of the wedding. "Mom," I said, my voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I've been so focused on being the bride that I forgot to honor the woman who made it all possible." My mother, ever gracious, simply smiled and pulled me into a hug. "Sweetheart, this day was about you. That's exactly how it should be." "No," I said firmly. "This day was about love, and your love is what made everything possible." As Marcus photographed us, other guests began to notice. Some of them approached, curious about what was happening. Gabriel's aunt, the same woman who had earlier mistaken my mother for catering staff, overheard our conversation. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she realized her mistake. She approached hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable, but knowing she needed to say something. I owe you an apology," she said to my mother. "I didn't realize I'm so sorry for my behavior earlier. My mother, with the grace she had shown all evening, simply nodded. It's quite all right. You couldn't have known. But it wasn't all right, and we all knew it. The assumptions that had been made, the way my mother had been overlooked and dismissed, spoke to something deeper than simple misunderstanding. Other guests began to approach, and gradually, the story emerged. They learned about the months of preparation, the hand-sewn decorations, the personal touches that had made the wedding so special. They learned about the woman who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, who had sacrificed her own comfort and recognition to ensure that her daughter's wedding day would be perfect. Gabriel's grandmother, the same woman who had grabbed my mother's arm earlier, approached with tears in her eyes. "I am so ashamed," she whispered. "I treated you terribly, and you helped me anyway. You're an angel." My maid of honor, Sarah, appeared at my side, the $20 bill still crumpled in her hand. "I need to apologize," she said, her voice shaking. "I gave you a tip. I gave the mother of the bride a tip because I thought—" She couldn't finish the sentence. My mother took the money gently from Sarah's hand and smiled. "Keep it," she said softly. "Buy yourself something nice. And don't feel bad. You were just trying to be kind." Gabriel's college friends, the ones who had joked about the cute little lady, approached as a group. Their earlier laughter had been replaced by genuine remorse. "We're so sorry," one of them said. "We had no idea. You made everything so beautiful." Oh, even the catering staff, who had been working alongside my mother all evening, began to understand. The head caterer approached with obvious admiration. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen someone work so hard for love. You put us all to shame." Gabriel's father, who had given the earlier speech, approached with obvious discomfort. I should have included you in my remarks," he said. "I had no idea about everything you'd done." "You weren't meant to know," my mother replied. "A mother's love isn't performed for recognition." But perhaps the most touching moment came when the elderly woman whose food my mother had helped cut during dinner slowly made her way over to us. She took my mother's hands in her own frail ones and said, I knew from the moment you helped me that you were someone special. The way you treated me, the gentleness in your touch, that's not the kindness of a stranger. That's the love of a mother." The venue coordinator, a woman who had been working weddings for decades, approached with tears in her eyes. "In all my years of doing this," she said, "I've never seen someone give so much of themselves for someone else's happiness. You are the heart of this celebration." Word spread through the remaining guests like wildfire. People began to understand that every beautiful detail they had admired, every thoughtful touch that had made the evening special, had come from the quiet woman they had overlooked all evening. The band leader, who had adjusted the volume at my mother's request, announced to the remaining guests, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special woman here tonight, the mother of the bride, who created the magic you've all been enjoying." The applause that followed was different from the polite clapping that had greeted the earlier speeches. This was genuine, heartfelt appreciation from people who finally understood what they had witnessed. In the days following the wedding, when Marcus sent us the photographs, the images that moved me most weren't the traditional wedding shots. They were the photos of my mother in the space she had created, the photos of her hands arranging flowers, the photos of us together at the end of the evening. But there was one photo that particularly struck me. It was taken just after Marcus had first approached my mother, when she was still sitting alone on the bench. In the photo, she's looking out at the party, and her expression is one of quiet satisfaction, mixed with sadness. She had created something beautiful, had given her daughter the perfect wedding day, but she had done so at the cost of her own inclusion in the celebration. Marcus had captured something that I had failed to see in the moment, the loneliness of sacrifice, the invisible labor of love, the way that those who give the most are often seen the least. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking constantly about that evening. How had I been so focused on being the center of attention that I had failed to ensure my mother was honored? How had I allowed her to be treated as invisible on a day that existed only because of her love and sacrifice? I realized that the wedding, for all its beauty and perfection, had revealed something uncomfortable about my priorities and values. I had been so concerned with creating an Instagram-worthy event that I had forgotten to create space for the people who mattered most. My mother had spent months preparing for my wedding, not just in terms of decorations and logistics, but emotionally. She had poured her heart into every detail, seeing it as her final gift to me as I transitioned into married life. And in return, I had allowed her to be overlooked, ignored, and even mistaken for hired help. The photographer's question, "Are you the owner of this place?" had been more profound than he could have known. Yes, my mother was the owner of that place, in every way that mattered. She had created it with her love, her labor, and her sacrifice. She was the owner of every beautiful moment of that day. That conversation with Marcus changed something fundamental in my relationship with my mother. It forced me to confront the ways I had taken her for granted, not just on my wedding day, but throughout my life. I began to see the countless ways she had been invisible, the endless acts of service and sacrifice that had shaped my life without my recognition or appreciation. I realized that her love had been the constant thread through every success, every milestone, every moment of joy in my life. In the days that followed, I learned even more about what my mother had done for my wedding. I discovered that she had worked extra shifts at the hospital where she was a nurse, taking on double shifts and weekend work to pay for half of the wedding costs. She had never mentioned this, never made me feel guilty about the expense. I learned that she had spent her vacation days coordinating with vendors, using her precious time off, not for rest, but for ensuring my day would be perfect. She had given up her annual visit to see her sister, whom she hadn't seen in 2 years, because the timing conflicted with wedding preparations. I found out that she had sold her grandmother's antique jewelry, pieces that had been in our family for generations, to pay for my wedding dress when I fell in love with one that was beyond our budget. She had told me that she had found some extra money and insisted on buying it for me. Most heartbreaking of all, I discovered that she had been planning to surprise me with a speech at the reception, sharing stories about my childhood and expressing her love and pride. She had written it weeks in advance, practicing it until she knew it by heart. But when she realized there was no place for her in the program, she had simply folded the speech and put it away. I found that speech later, tucked into her jewelry box. It was written on paper that had been carefully pressed and folded, the words filled with such love and pride that reading it brought me to tears. She had written about the little girl who used to play dress-up in her old nightgowns, dreaming of her wedding day. She had written about watching me grow into the woman I had become, about her hopes for my future, about how proud she was to be my mother. She had planned to end the speech with a blessing, asking all the guests to join her in wishing Gabriel and me a lifetime of happiness. But instead, she had remained silent, invisible, unrecognized. The wedding photos that we display in our home now include several of those final shots that Marcus took of my mother. When people ask about them, I tell them the story, about the woman who created beauty without seeking recognition, who gave everything without expecting anything in return, who was finally seen and honored by a stranger who recognized the love behind the details. But I also tell them about the speech that was never given, about the love that was never acknowledged, about the woman who made everything possible while remaining invisible. I've kept that speech framed next to our wedding photo, a reminder of the love that was there all along, waiting to be recognized and celebrated. My wedding day taught me that the most important people in our lives are often the ones who ask for the least attention. They are the ones who work quietly behind the scenes, who sacrifice without fanfare, who love without condition or expectation of recognition. My mother spent my entire childhood and young adulthood being the invisible force that made my life possible. She worked extra shifts to pay for my school clothes. She stayed up late helping with homework. She attended every school play and sporting event. She celebrated my successes and comforted me through my failures. And on my wedding day, she continued in that same role, working quietly to ensure my happiness, asking for nothing in return, content to remain in the background as long as I was in the spotlight. It took a photographer's trained eye to see what I had missed, that the most important person at the wedding wasn't the bride or the groom, but the woman who had made it all possible through her love. In the years since my wedding, I've tried to live with a greater awareness of the invisible labor that surrounds us all. I've tried to recognize and honor the people who give without asking, who serve without seeking recognition, who love without condition. I've also tried to model a different kind of relationship with my mother, one where her contributions are acknowledged, where her sacrifices are honored, where her love is celebrated rather than simply accepted as a given. The wedding day that I had planned so meticulously ended up teaching me the most important lesson of all, that love is not found in perfect decorations or flawless execution, but in the quiet acts of service that often go unnoticed. My mother was indeed the owner of my wedding day, not because she possessed it, but because she had created it with her own hands, her own heart, and her own endless capacity for love. And now finally, she is seen.